What do you see when you think about World War II? You probably see soldiers, you see tanks and planes, you see grainy black and white images of conflict, and that makes sense. It was the biggest war in history. It involved more than 100 million people from over 30 countries. The numbers are hard to even imagine. But what if that's only one part of the story? What about the other 99% of life that kept going? People still fell in love, they still went to the movies. They still told jokes and played with their kids and worried about dinner. They found ways to live, not just survive. The war was a massive dark cloud over everything. But underneath that cloud, billions of small human moments were happening every single day. Was it possible to find joy when the world seemed to be ending? How did people hold on to their humanity? These aren't just stories of soldiers, they are stories of inventors, farmers, artists, and regular people who were asked to do irregular things. Let's look at a different set of pictures from that time. Number 20. Could a backyard garden really change the outcome of a war? Imagine a photo. It's not a soldier with a rifle. It's a woman in a simple dress and a headscarf kneeling in the dirt. Her hands are covered in soil. She's holding up a massive cabbage and she's smiling. Behind her is a small, tidy plot of land next to a very ordinary house. This wasn't a farm. This was a backyard, and that backyard was a battlefield of its own. This was the world of the Victory Garden. The idea was simple. The big commercial farms needed to send their food overseas to feed millions of soldiers. Ships that once carried food from other countries were now carrying troops and weapons, or they were being sunk. This created a huge food problem on the home front. The solution was for people to grow their own. It started as a suggestion. It quickly became a national mission. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture led the charge. They printed pamphlets, they put up posters, they ran ads in magazines. The message was clear. Our food is fighting. By 1943, the results were staggering. More than 20 million victory gardens were planted across the country. Think about that number. That's gardens and backyards and vacant lots on apartment building rooftops. Even the lawn of the White House had a victory garden planted by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. These weren't just a few tomatoes here and there. Together, these small gardens produced between 9 and 10 million tons of fruits and vegetables. That was about 40% of all the fresh produce consumed in the entire country during the peak years. The United Kingdom had its own version, called the Dig for Victory campaign. With German U-boats sinking supply ships, Britain was facing starvation. The government told its people that they had to use every spare piece of land. Public parks were plowed over. Flower beds were converted to vegetable patches. The moat of the Tower of London was used to grow cabbages. It was a total transformation of the landscape, but it was more than just food. Planting a garden was something you could do. When the news was bad and you felt helpless, you could go outside and pull weeds. You could see something grow. It was a direct, tangible contribution to the war effort. It connected neighbors. People shared seeds, tools, and advice. Communities held canning sessions to preserve the harvest for the winter. This movement, documented in books like Ursula Buchan's A Garden for Victory, shows how civilian morale was cultivated just like the soil. It was a quiet, determined rebellion against scarcity and fear. It was a way to create life in a time of so much destruction. So we see the pictures of the gardens and know how much they produced, but what about the things we can't measure? How many friendships were formed over a shared row of beans? We know the official statistics, but how much unrecorded food was shared with a neighbor who was struggling? And what forgotten knowledge about gardening and food preservation passed down urgently during those years has now been lost. Number 19. What happened when millions of women picked up power tools? Here's another picture. A young woman is bent over a massive piece of machinery. Her hair is tied up in a bandana. There's a smudge of grease on her cheek. She's holding a rivet gun, and she looks focused. She isn't making a dress or baking a pie. She's building an airplane. She was one of millions who completely changed what it meant to be a woman in the workplace. Before the war, for the most part, a woman's place was in the home. Certain jobs were acceptable, like being a teacher, a nurse, or secretary. But heavy industry? That was a man's world. Then the men went to fight. The factories, however, needed to run faster than ever before. They had to produce an incredible amount of planes, ships, tanks, and bullets. Who was going to do the work? The answer was women. The government and industries launched a massive recruitment campaign. The most famous image from this time is Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who represented the strong, capable woman working in the factory. The campaign was a huge success. Between 1940 and 1945, the female workforce in the U.S. grew by over 50%. Nearly 1 out of every 4 married women went to work outside the home. They weren't just doing simple assembly line tasks. They were welders, mechanics, and machine operators. They built B-17 bombers and Liberty ships. They learned complex technical skills in a matter of weeks. This was a massive social shock. These women started earning their own paychecks, giving them a new sense of financial independence. But it wasn't easy. They often faced resentment from the male workers who were left. They were usually paid less than men for doing the same job. And many of them were still expected to do all the cooking, cleaning, and childcare when they got home from a 10-hour shift. To help with this, the government did something unprecedented. Through the Lanham Act of 1940, it provided federal funding for daycare centers for the children of working mothers. By 1945, these centers were caring for an estimated 130,000 children. It was the first time the U.S. government had ever subsidized childcare on such a large scale. Historians like Penny Coleman in her book Rosie the Riveter Women Working on the Home Front in World War II detail the personal stories of these women. They talk about the pride they felt in their work. They knew that every rivet they drove was helping to bring a husband, a brother, or a son home safely. They proved that women could do any job a man could do, and then the war ended. The men came home, and they wanted their jobs back. The government propaganda machine that had told women to go to work now told them to go back home. The daycare centers closed. Many women were fired or voluntarily left their jobs, but something had changed for good. The door had been opened. These women had seen a different kind of life, and they passed that experience on to their daughters. The Rosie the Riveter generation didn't start the feminist movement of the 1960s, but they certainly laid the groundwork. But what do we not know? How many women secretly wanted to keep their jobs but felt pressured by society to leave? We have statistics on employment, but how many stories of workplace harassment and discrimination were never told? And how did this brief period of independence fundamentally change private family dynamics in ways that history books can't capture? Number 18. Did dancing really help people survive the Blitz? Picture this. The city is dark. Blackout curtains cover every window. Air raid sirens could go off at any minute. But inside a crowded dance hall, the room is alive. A big band is on stage, horns blaring, couples are packed onto the floor, dancing the jitterbug and the Lindy Hop with wild energy. For a few hours, the war outside doesn't exist. This was the swing era, and during the war, swing music wasn't just entertainment. It was a lifeline. For young people facing an uncertain future, it was a way to feel alive and free. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, their music was the soundtrack of the generation. It was broadcast overseas on the Armed Forces radio service, bringing a piece of home to soldiers in far-off places. Bands led by figures like Miller actually enlisted and toured, playing for troops near the front lines. The Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band played hundreds of shows for an estimated audience of over 1 million soldiers. In Britain during the Blitz, the government was initially suspicious of dance halls. They worried about morality and people gathering in large groups that could be targets. But they quickly realized that these dances were essential for morale. As author Juliet Gardner explains in Wartime Britain 1939 to 1945, dancing was a form of psychological release. After a night spent huddled in an air raid shelter, being able to go out and lose yourself in music and movement was a way to fight back against the fear and depression. It was a defiant act of normalcy. The music and dancing also brought people together. American GIs stationed in Britain flocked to these dance halls, bringing with them new dance moves and a bit of American confidence. This led to a huge cultural exchange. It also led to tens of thousands of wartime marriages between British women and American soldiers. These guy brides would eventually leave their homes and families to start a new life in a country they had only heard about in movies and songs. The music itself was revolutionary. It was fast, energetic, and built for dancing. It was a complete contrast to the grim reality of the war. It was also a source of controversy. Some older people thought it was too wild, too loud, but for the young generation, it was their music. It represented hope, youth, and a future they were all fighting for. The BBC in Britain even had a music while you work program, broadcasting upbeat music into factories to boost productivity and morale. Studies were done that showed the music actually did lead to an increase in output. So we can see the photos of the crowded dance halls. We can listen to the recordings of the music, but what can't we know? How many life-altering decisions to get married, to join the service, to just keep going one more day nunts were made on a dance floor under the influence of a swinging big band. We know about the official USO tours, but how many impromptu jam sessions happened in barracks and bunkers that gave soldiers a moment of peace? And how did the shared experience of this music bridge the social and racial divides of the time in ways that official policies never could? Number 17, how do you build a bomber out of pots and pans? The next image is of a child. He's no more than 10 years old. He's standing next to a huge pile of metal. He's proudly holding up an old aluminum pot. He's not playing, he's working, he's a soldier on the home front, and his weapon is junk. This was the world of the salvage drive. War requires a mind-boggling amount of raw materials. Iron to make ships, and rubber to make tires, aluminum to make planes, paper to make packaging for ammunition, fats and grease to make explosives. And all of these things were in short supply. The solution was a massive nationwide recycling program. But it wasn't called recycling then, it was called salvage. Governments urged their citizens to collect everything. Posters screamed, "Get in the scrap and save your cans, help a man." People went through their homes, their garages, their barns. They collected old pots and pans, rusty farm equipment, broken radios, and old tires. Kids were a huge part of this effort. They organized neighborhood drives, going door to door with their wagons to collect scrap metal and old newspapers. They saw it as a competition with schools and towns vying to see who could collect the most. For them, it was a way to be directly involved in the war. The numbers are incredible. In the United States, a single campaign in 1942 called for 17 million tons of scrap metal. The public responded by collecting over 23 million tons. People donated everything. Cities ripped up old streetcar tracks. A town in Wyoming donated an old Civil War cannon. In Britain, the government took the iron railings from parks and homes. They famously collected over 1 million tons of aluminum, much of it from household pots and pans, under the slogan, "We'll turn your pots and pans into Spitfires." While the metallurgical science of turning old saucepans directly into fighter planes was more complicated than the slogan suggested, the aluminum was desperately needed, and the campaign was a huge morale booster. Even things you would never think of were collected. Women were asked to save the fat drippings from cooking. This grease was collected by local butchers, and the glycerin was extracted to make nitroglycerin for explosives. A pound of waste fat could contain enough glycerin for several artillery shells. Silk and nylon stockings were collected to be used for things like powder bags for naval guns. Nothing was wasted. This culture of salvage and frugality, as detailed in works like Don't You Know There's a War On by Richard R. Lingeman, fundamentally changed how people thought about consumption. It wasn't about throwing things away. It was about finding a new use for everything. It fostered a sense of shared purpose and collective responsibility. Everyone, even a child with a wagon full of newspapers, was contributing to the larger effort, but history leaves us with questions. How much of the collected material was actually usable for war production, and how much was simply a tool for boosting public morale? We have records of the tons collected, but we have no way of knowing the personal stories behind the objects given up the family heirloom, the child's favorite toy. And did this intense period of forced recycling create a generation of conservationists, or did the post-war boom in consumer goods erase those lessons completely? Number 16. What does a soldier fear more than a bullet? Let's look at a different kind of image. It's not of a battle, it's a sketch drawn by an artist in a medical tent. It shows a young man with a terrible facial injury, but the sketch also includes lines and notes mapping out a new face for him. This is the work of a plastic surgeon, a field of medicine that was forged in the crucible of war. We think of war in terms of life and death. But for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the outcome was something in between survival, but with devastating injuries. Burns, shrapnel wounds, and other trauma left men with disfigurements that made it impossible to return to a normal life. This created a desperate need for new medical techniques. A key figure in this story was Sir Harold Gillies, a surgeon from New Zealand working in Britain. During World War I, he had pioneered many of the techniques of modern plastic surgery. In World War II, he and his team, including his cousin Archibald McIndoe, took this work to a new level. McIndoe worked at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, England. He specialized in treating pilots and aircrew from the Royal Air Force who had suffered horrific burns when their planes were shot down. These men called themselves the Guinea Pig Club. McIndoe's approach was radical for the time. He didn't just focus on the physical surgery. He understood that the psychological recovery was just as important. He threw out the traditional sterile hospital rules. He allowed the men to wear their own clothes instead of hospital gowns. He encouraged them to drink beer in the hospital ward. He believed that they needed to regain their confidence and sense of self. Crucially, McIndoe worked with the local town of East Grinstead. He asked the townspeople not to stare at the men's injuries. He asked them to welcome the pilots into their homes, their shops, and their pubs. The town responded, and East Grinstead became known as the town that did not stare. The social and psychological support was as critical as the dozens of operations each man had to endure. And McIndoe's work, documented in books like The Guinea Pig Club by Edward Bishop, showed that healing was about more than just skin grafts. It was about rebuilding a person's entire life. The medical innovations were incredible. Surgeons developed new techniques for skin grafting, like the pedicle flap, which allowed them to move large sections of skin from one part of the body to another while keeping the blood supply intact. This was essential for rebuilding noses, eyelids, and entire faces. At the same time, another medical revolution was happening in the mass production of penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, it was a lab curiosity until a team at Oxford University figured out how to purify it during the war. Funded massive effort to save huge quantities. In 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat all the wounded soldiers of the Allied. It was a miracle drug that saved countless lives from infections that would have previously been a death sentence. But the history of this medical progress is incomplete. For every successful Guinea Pig Club story, how many soldiers were there whose psychological scars never healed? We celebrate the invention of penicillin, but how many other promising medical research projects were abandoned because they didn't have immediate military applications? And what were the long-term, unrecorded health consequences for the millions of soldiers exposed to new chemicals, intense stress, and experimental treatments? Or number 15, could a secret message be hidden in a knitting pattern? Imagine a quiet room, not a factory, not a command center, just a room full of people hunched over desks. They aren't soldiers. They are academics, mathematicians, and linguists. They are staring at long strings of nonsensical letters. The silence is broken only by the scratching of pens and the quiet clicking of a strange, complicated machine. They are fighting a secret war, and their weapons are their minds. This was the world of the codebreakers. The war was not just fought on land, at sea, and in the air. It was also fought in the invisible realm of radio waves. Both sides were constantly sending coded messages to direct their troops, ships, and submarines. Being able to intercept and read these messages could change the course of a battle or even the war itself. The most famous center for this work was Bletchley Park, a country estate in England. Here, a diverse group of people was secretly assembled. It included some of the most brilliant minds of the generation, like the mathematician Alan Turing, but it also included classicists, chess champions, and even winners of a crossword puzzle competition run by a newspaper. The government believed that people who were good at solving complex puzzles would be good at breaking codes. They were right. Their main target was the German Enigma machine, a complex device used to encrypt messages. At the beginning of the war, the code was considered unbreakable, but thanks to earlier work by Polish mathematicians and the genius of the team at Bletchley Park, they began to find ways to crack it. They developed massive, complex electromechanical machines, the forerunners of modern computers, to help them test thousands of possible settings every day. One of these machines was called the Bomb, designed by Turing and Gordon Welchman. By the end of the war, Bletchley Park was decoding thousands of messages a day. The information they gained, known as Ultra, was top secret and gave Allied commanders a huge advantage. Historians believe that the work at Bletchley Park shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. The secrecy was absolute. The people who worked there could not tell anyone what they did, not even their families. They were told, you are not to talk about your work outside of this room, not in the canteen, not in your billets, not on the train, not to your family, not to each other. They carried this secret for decades. It was only in the 1970s that the story of Bletchley Park began to be declassified and made public, as revealed in books like The Secret Life of Bletchley Park by Sinclair McKay. And it wasn't just happening in Britain. In the Pacific, American codebreakers made a crucial breakthrough when they cracked the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. This intelligence was critical to the American victory at the Battle of Midway in 1942, a major turning point in the war in the Pacific. But the shadows of secrecy still hide so much. We know about the big breakthroughs, but how many codes were never broken? How many brilliant code breakers have been lost to history because their work remains classified? And what other forms of secret communication were used, like the rumored codes hidden in knitting patterns by civilian spies that were never officially documented? Number 14, how did a cartoon mouse go to war? The picture here is an illustration. It's painted on the side of an American fighter plane. It's a familiar character, but he looks different. He's wearing a pilot's helmet and goggles, and he looks determined. It's Mickey Mouse ready for combat. This wasn't a joke. It was part of a massive official effort to use art and animation for the war. When the war began, Hollywood and its artists were eager to help. The most famous example is the Walt Disney Studio. The U.S. government quickly realized that Disney's skill at communication could be a powerful tool. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army actually stationed soldiers at the Disney Studio in Burbank, California, to protect it as a vital piece of war infrastructure. Over the course of the war, the Disney Studio dedicated over 90% of its production to the war effort. They made training films for soldiers on topics ranging from aircraft identification to naval strategy. Using animation, they could explain complex mechanical concepts much more clearly than a dry manual. They made propaganda films for the public. One of the most famous was Der Führer's Face, a 1943 animated short starring Donald Duck having a nightmare about living in an authoritarian state. It was funny, but it had a serious message. It won an Academy Award, but maybe the most visible contribution was the creation of insignia. The studio created over 1,200 unique military insignia for American and Allied units for free. A squadron of fighter pilots could write to the studio and request a design. And soon, planes, tanks, and ships were decorated with images of Donald Duck carrying a bomb or Pluto listening for submarines. As documented by historian David Lezak in Service with a Smile, this art was a huge boost to morale. It gave units a unique identity and a touch of humor in a very serious business. It was a small reminder of home. Other animation studios also pitched in. Warner Bros. Put Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck to work selling war bonds in short cartoons shown in theaters. Famous cartoonists created posters and comic strips to support the war effort. Even Dr. Seuss Theodore Geisel spent the war working for the Army's animation department, creating training films and propaganda posters. This was a war fought with images as much as with weapons. Propaganda posters were everywhere, encouraging people to buy war bonds, conserve materials, and keep quiet about military information. The government's Office of War Information carefully managed the messages the public received. They wanted to create a sense of unity, patriotism, and confidence in victory. Art was not a luxury. It was a critical part of the national strategy. But what don't we see in these bright, cheerful cartoons? How much did the simplified, often stereotypical portrayals of the enemy in these films contribute to post-war prejudice? We know how many insignia Disney designed, but how many unofficial, soldier-drawn pieces of art, the true folk art of the war, have been lost or painted over? And how did the artists themselves reconcile creating fun-loving characters for children with using those same characters to promote a deadly conflict? Number 13, can you fight a war without firing a shot? Here's an unusual photograph. A group of young men are in a forest. They are not carrying guns. They are carrying axes and saws. They are dressed in simple work clothes. These men were soldiers of a different kind. They were conscientious objectors. In a time of total war, the idea of refusing to fight was controversial, to say the least. But in countries like the United States and Britain, the law made provisions for people who objected to military service on moral or religious grounds. These men were not cowards. They simply believed that killing another human being was wrong, no matter the reason. But they were still required to serve their country, so they were assigned to alternative service. In the US, this was called Civilian Public Service, CPS. Over the course of the war, about 12,000 conscientious objectors were sent to work in CPS camps. These camps were often in remote, rural areas. The men did work that was considered of national importance. They built roads, fought forest fires, and worked on soil conservation projects. The work was hard, the pay was non-existent, and they were often looked down upon by the public. But some of them did even more dangerous work. Over 1,500 CPS men volunteered to serve as medical guinea pigs. They subjected themselves to scientific experiments designed to help soldiers on the front lines. They allowed themselves to be infected with diseases like jaundice and atypical pneumonia, so scientists could study the illnesses and develop treatments. In the Minnesota starvation experiment, a group of volunteers ate a severely restricted diet for months so researchers could learn how to best refeed starving populations in Europe after the war. This was incredibly grueling and dangerous work, all done voluntarily. These men, as detailed in We Will Not Be Silent by Russell Friedman, were willing to sacrifice their bodies for the good of others, just not to kill. Another group of objectors served as medics on the front lines. They were officially non-combatants, but they faced all the same dangers as the soldiers. One of the most famous was Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist who served as a combat medic in the Pacific. He refused to carry a weapon during the battle for Okinawa. He single-handedly saved the lives of an estimated 75 wounded soldiers, lowering them one by one from a high cliff while under intense enemy fire. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. The story of conscientious objectors is a complicated one. They were often misunderstood and ostracized, but their commitment to their principles and their willingness to serve in other, often dangerous ways shows a different kind of courage. They challenged the idea that patriotism had to be expressed with a gun, but their story is full of unanswered questions. How many men were not granted conscientious objector status and were imprisoned for their beliefs? We have the official numbers for the CPS camps, but how did the experience of being separated from society and performing grueling labor affect these men for the rest of their lives? And how many acts of quiet, personal, conscientious objection by soldiers who simply refused to fire their weapons in a particular moment happened on the battlefield and were never recorded? Number 12. Where did love fit in a world at war? The photo is a simple one. A young couple, a soldier in his uniform, and a woman in her best dress are standing on the steps of a courthouse. They look happy, but also a little rushed. They've just gotten married, and they probably only have a few days or maybe even a few hours together before he has to ship out. War has a way of speeding everything up, especially romance. The uncertainty of the future made people seize the moment. While couples who might have dated for years in peacetime decided to get married after just a few weeks. The result was a marriage boom. In the United States, the marriage rate, which had been declining, suddenly shot up. In 1942 alone, there were 1.8 million weddings, a million more than in 1932. These were goodbye weddings. They were often small, simple affairs, squeezed in while the soldier was on a short leave. There was no time for big church weddings with fancy receptions. A trip to the justice of the peace was often all that was possible. For these couples, marriage was a promise. It was something to hold on to, a hope for a future after the war was over. For the soldier, having a wife back home gave him a powerful reason to survive. For the woman, it was a way to formalize her commitment and, in a practical sense, to become his next of kin. This led to a whole new kind of relationship marriage by mail. A husband and wife might spend years apart, their entire relationship conducted through letters. These V mail letters or victory mail were photographed, put on microfilm, shipped overseas, and then printed out again near the front. This saved a huge amount of cargo space, but it also meant the letters were censored and not very private. Still, they were a vital link. Couples shared their daily lives, their fears, and their dreams for the future, all on these small sheets of paper. The collection Since You Went Away, World War II Letters from American Women on the Home Front, edited by Judy Barrett Lidoff and David C. Smith, gives a powerful glimpse into these long-distance relationships. Of course, this period also saw a rise in Dear John letters, the infamous notes from a wife or girlfriend back home breaking off the relationship. For a soldier thousands of miles from home, receiving such a letter could be psychologically devastating. And then there was the phenomenon of the EGI brides. As American soldiers were stationed in countries like Britain, Australia, and France, thousands of them fell in love and married local women. After the war, these women, many of whom had never left their hometowns, faced the daunting journey to a new life in America. Special were bride ships were commissioned to bring tens of thousands of them, along with their children, to the United States. It was a massive migration of women, each with her own personal story of love and hope. But so many questions remain. How many of these hasty wartime marriages ended in divorce after the reality of post-war life set in? We can count the weddings, but how do we measure the amount of loneliness and anxiety hidden behind the brave faces in the wedding photos? And what are the untold stories of the children of these unions who grew up with fathers they barely knew, or with the challenge of bridging two different cultures in their own homes? Number 11, could you make a dress out of a parachute? Let's look at picture of fashion. A woman is wearing a stylish, well-made dress, but the material is a bit unusual. It's a soft white silk. If you look closely, you can see the faint lines of the seams where a parachute was taken apart. In a time of extreme rationing, creativity became the ultimate fashion accessory. War meant that everything was rationed. Food, gasoline, and rubber are the things we usually think of, but clothing was also strictly controlled. In Britain, the government introduced the utility clothing scheme. Clothes had to be made to a certain standard using as little material as possible. Things like cuffs on men's trousers, extra pockets, and fancy embroidery were banned. The goal was to make sure everyone had enough, but nobody had too much. It was fashioned by government decree. In the United States, the restrictions were similar. The War Production Board issued rules that limited the amount of fabric that could be used in a garment. The victory suit for men had no vest, no cuffs, and narrower lapels. For women, hemlines rose to save fabric. Silk and nylon needed for parachutes were no longer available for stockings. Women had to go bare-legged or use leg makeup, sometimes even drawing a line down the back of their legs with an eyebrow pencil to simulate the look of a seam. But people are creative. They found ways to be stylish even with the restrictions. The make do and mend philosophy was everywhere. Old clothes were taken apart and remade into new ones. An old blanket could become a winter coat. People learned to knit, to sew, and to repair. Magazines were filled with tips on how to care for clothes to make them last longer and how to restyle an old dress to make it look new. The parachute dress is the perfect example of this ingenuity. A soldier who managed to bring a silk parachute home as a souvenir was bringing back a treasure trove of luxurious fabric. It was often used to make wedding dresses. For a bride who couldn't buy a traditional satin gown, a dress made from the parachute that had saved her fiancé's life was incredibly meaningful. This period also saw the rise of new styles born out of necessity. The headscarf, for example, became popular among women working in factories to keep their hair safely out of the machinery. Full trousers, once rarely worn by women, became common for practical work. These were changes driven by function, not by Paris fashion houses. As fashion historian Jonathan Walford has noted, wartime restrictions ironically forced designers and ordinary people to become more creative, leading to simple, elegant silhouettes that would influence fashion for years to come. But what parts of this story are missing? How big was the black market for clothing and fabrics, and who was running it? We see the cheerful make do and mend posters, but how much frustration and resentment did people feel about the drab, uniform-like clothing they were forced to wear? And how many brilliant, innovative fashion designs created by ordinary people out of scrap materials were never photographed and are now lost forever? Number 10, was there a secret army of animals? The images of a dog. He's a small terrier, and he's wearing a tiny military-style coat. He's sitting on a soldier's lap. This isn't just a pet. This is a mascot, a morale booster, and in some cases a fellow soldier. The role of animals in the war is a side of the story we rarely hear. Animals have always been a part of human conflict, mostly as beasts of burden like horses and mules. And they were certainly used that way in this war. But they also took on new, more surprising roles. The British and American militaries, for example, created official dogs for defense programs. People were asked to donate their family pets to the war effort. Over 10,000 dogs were trained for military service in the US alone. They served as sentries, scouts, and messengers. A dog's keen sense of hearing and smell could detect an enemy soldier long before a human could. One of the most famous war dogs was a Yorkshire Terrier named Smokey. She was found in a foxhole in New Guinea and adopted by an American soldier. She flew on combat missions, survived typhoons, and even learned to string a communication wire through a narrow pipe, saving a construction crew days of dangerous work. Her story, and others like it, are told in books like Smokey the War Dog by Damian Lewis. Pigeons were another unsung hero. In an age before satellite communication, reliable messaging was a huge challenge. Radios could be intercepted or break down. Carrier pigeons were often the most dependable way to get a message through. The British military used over 250,000 pigeons during the war. They were dropped in cages by parachute to resistance groups in occupied Europe, who would then use them to send back vital intelligence. 32 of these pigeons were awarded the Dickon Medal, the highest British award for animal valor. And then there were the mascots. Almost every ship, squadron, and unit seemed to have one. It might be a dog, a cat, a monkey, or even a bear. These animals provided a touch of home and a source of comfort in the stressful environment of war. They were a reminder of a gentler, more normal world. A famous example was a dog named Rip, who was found as a stray after an air raid in London. He became the first search and rescue dog, credited with finding over 100 victims trapped in bombed-out buildings. But the story doesn't end there. There were more unusual animal projects. The U.S. military experimented with bot bombs, a plan to attach tiny incendiary devices to bats and release them over Japanese cities, where they would roost in buildings and start fires. The project was tested but never used in combat. This hidden history of animal involvement raises some strange questions. How many military operations succeeded or failed because of the actions of a dog, a pigeon, or a mule? We know about the animals that were officially recognized, but how many countless stray animals were informally adopted by soldiers and provided unrecorded moments of comfort and companionship? And what are the ethical implications of using animals in human conflicts, a practice that continues to this day in different forms? Number 9, what did it sound like to be at home during the war? And picture a family. They are gathered in their living room in the evening. There are no screens, no phones. They are all looking at a large wooden box in the corner of the room. A warm yellow light glows from its dial. They are listening to the radio. For millions of people on the home front, the radio was the central piece of furniture in the house. It was their main source of news, entertainment, and connection to the outside world. In an era before television and the internet, the radio was everything. And the sound of the war was the sound of the radio. It was how people got their news. They would gather to listen to the evening broadcasts, hanging on every word from reporters like Edward R. Murrow. His live reports from London during the Blitz, with the sounds of air raid sirens in the background, brought the reality of the war into American living rooms for the first time. His famous opening, "This is London," became iconic. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used the radio for his fireside chats, speaking directly to the American people in a calm, reassuring voice that made them feel like he was in the room with them. But the radio wasn't just for serious news, it was also the primary source of entertainment and escape. Their families would listen to comedy shows with stars like Jack Benny or Bob Hope. They would follow the adventures in radio dramas like The Lone Ranger or The Shadow. And as we've seen, they would listen to the big band music that defined the era. The government understood the power of radio for morale. The Office of War Information produced its own radio shows and worked with Hollywood stars to create programs that promoted patriotism and support for the war effort. Radio was also a powerful weapon of propaganda. The BBC World Service broadcast in multiple languages, sending messages of hope and defiance into occupied Europe. People would risk imprisonment or death to secretly listen to these broadcasts. On the other side, figures like Tokyo Rose, a name given by soldiers to several female broadcasters of Japanese propaganda, would try to demoralize Allied troops with their programs. The very act of listening to the radio created a sense of shared experience. Millions of people, separated by geography, were all listening to the same program at the same time. They were laughing at the same jokes, hearing the same news, and listening to the same music. As historian Gerd Horton argues in Radio Goes to War, this created a powerful sense of national unity that was crucial for maintaining public support for the long, difficult war. But what parts of this audio history have gone silent? We have recordings of the famous broadcasts, but what about the countless hours of local radio programming that reflected the specific concerns and culture of small towns across the country? How many personal family stories were shaped by a song or a news report heard on the radio at a critical moment? And how did the constant presence of war news in the home, for the first time in history, change the psychology of the civilians who were listening? Number 8. How did you have fun when nothing was for sale? The image is of a group of teenagers. They are gathered around a jukebox in a diner. They are laughing and drinking sodas. Even with a war on, life had to go on. And for teenagers, that meant finding ways to have fun, to be social, and to be, well, teenagers. The war created a strange new world for young people. With their fathers away at war and their mothers often working in factories, many teenagers had more freedom and independence than ever before. They also had money in their pockets from part-time jobs, which were plentiful. This combination of freedom and cash helped to create the first real teenage culture. They developed their own style. For boys, it might be a zoot suit with its wide-legged, high-waisted trousers and long coat. This style was controversial and even led to riots in some cities, as it was seen as unpatriotic for using so much fabric during a time of rationing. For girls, it was bobby socks and saddle shoes. They had their own slang and their own music. They were the original bobby soxers who screamed for young singers like Frank Sinatra. With gasoline rationed and car production halted, teenagers couldn't just go for a drive. Their social lives revolved around places they could get to on foot or by bus. For diners, soda fountains, and movie theaters were the hot spots. They could listen to the latest hits on the jukebox, share a milkshake, and gossip. For the price of a movie ticket, they could escape into a Hollywood fantasy for a few hours. High school life also changed. Schools became centers for the war effort. Students participated in scrap drives, sold war bonds, and planted school victory gardens. But they still had dances, football games, and proms. These events took on a special importance. They were a chance to feel normal, to celebrate being young in a world that was forcing them to grow up too fast. This teenage culture is documented in personal diaries and letters from the time, collected in books like A Teenager's War by Ron Baton. They reveal the mix of typical teenage concerns: dating, friendships, school species, with the ever-present background of the war. A girl might write about her new dress in one entry and about her brother being shipped overseas in the next. This was a generation that straddled two worlds. They were old enough to understand the seriousness of the war and to contribute to the effort, but they were young enough to still crave the fun and excitement of youth. They created a vibrant subculture that would lay the foundation for the youth movements of the coming decades. But the historical record is spotty. We see the popular images of happy teenagers at soda fountains, but how did the war-related stress and anxiety affect them in ways they couldn't articulate? How many young people had their education cut short to go to work or to war? And how did the experience of growing up with so much responsibility and independence shape the way they would later raise their own children? The Bobby Boomers. Number 7. Could a library card be a weapon? Let's look at a simple, quiet scene. A librarian is stamping a book for a young boy. The library is filled with people of all ages sitting at long tables reading. In the middle of a loud, chaotic war, the library offered something rare, a place of peace and quiet thought. But it was also much more than that. During the war, people were hungry for information. They wanted to understand what was happening in the world. They wanted to learn about the countries where their loved ones were fighting. Libraries saw a massive surge in demand for maps, atlases, and books about history and foreign affairs. Librarians became frontline information workers, helping people make sense of a confusing and frightening world. But people were also hungry for escape. With money tight and travel impossible, books offered a way to go anywhere in the world, or even to other worlds entirely. Reading provided a much-needed psychological release from the daily stress of the war. Circulation numbers at public libraries across the U.S. and Britain soared. The American Library Association actively promoted the idea that reading was a patriotic act, a way to stay informed and engaged as a citizen. The government also saw the value of books. The Council on Books in Wartime was formed by publishers, with the slogan, "Books are weapons in the war of ideas." They worked with the military to produce special lightweight paperback editions of popular books called Armed Services Editions. These were designed to fit in the pocket of a soldier's uniform. Over 120 million of these books were distributed to American troops overseas. They included everything from classic novels to westerns to poetry. For a soldier far from home with long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of terror, a book could be a friend, a comfort, and a vital link to the world of ideas and culture he was fighting to protect. Many libraries on the home front also served as community hubs. They hosted talks and discussions, collected books to send to soldiers, and served as information centers for government programs like rationing and civil defense. The librarians themselves were often at the forefront of fighting censorship and promoting intellectual freedom, arguing that access to a wide range of ideas was essential for a healthy democracy, especially in wartime. This quiet intellectual side of the war effort is often overlooked. But as historian Molly Guptill-Manning shows in her book, When Books Went to War, the effort to keep people reading and thinking was seen as a critical part of the fight. It was a war against ignorance and despair as much as it was against a foreign enemy. But what don't the circulation records tell us? What controversial or unpatriotic books were quietly removed from library shelves during the war? How many soldiers' lives were profoundly changed by a single book they read in a trench or a barracks in a way they never wrote down? And how did the shared national experience of reading the same Armed Services editions create a common cultural touchstone for a whole generation of men? Number 6, who kept the score when the players went to war? The photo could be from any summer afternoon. A batter is swinging at a pitch. The stands are full of fans. But look closer. Many of the players look very young or a bit older than you'd expect. And in another photo, the players are all women. This is the world of wartime sports. When the war started, many people assumed that professional sports would shut down for the duration. But President Roosevelt felt differently. In 1942, he wrote a famous letter to the Commissioner of Baseball, known as the Green Light Letter. He argued that baseball was a valuable source of recreation and a morale booster for the American people, and that it should continue. So, the games went on. But the teams were very different. Hundreds of the best professional athletes enlisted or were drafted into the military. Stars like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams traded their baseball uniforms for military ones. To fill the rosters, teams had to sign players who were too young, too old, or physically ineligible for military service. The quality of play may have suffered, but the fans didn't seem to mind. They were just happy to have the distraction. But the most famous and innovative response to the player shortage was the creation of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in 1943. The league, which was the inspiration for the movie A League of Their Own, was the brainchild of chewing gum magnate Philip K. Wrigley. He wanted to keep ballparks filled, and he figured that women playing baseball could be a major attraction. The league was a huge success. The women were talented athletes who played a fast, exciting brand of baseball. But they also had to deal with a strange set of rules. They were required to attend charm school and were given strict guidelines on makeup and hairstyles. They had to wear short skirts as part of their uniforms, which made sliding into a base a very painful experience. Despite these challenges, the players won the hearts of fans across the Midwest. The league continued for 11 seasons, giving hundreds of women the chance to play professional sports at a time when that was almost unheard of. Sports also played a huge role in military life. Every military base had teams for baseball, basketball, and football. These games were a great way to relieve boredom, build teamwork, and maintain physical fitness. They also provided a powerful connection to home. As detailed by sports historians, the results of the World Series were front-page news, even in military newspapers near the front lines. So sports didn't stop. They adapted. They became a symbol of the normalcy and resilience that people were trying to hold on to. A baseball game was a few hours where you could forget about the war and just be a fan. But there are gaps in this story. We celebrate the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, but what about the countless other women's sports leagues that may have existed on a smaller, local level? How did racial segregation in sports, which was still the norm, affect the morale of African American soldiers and civilians? And how many promising athletic careers were cut short by the war, leaving us to wonder about the records that were never broken and the games that were never played? Number 5. What did the enemy look like up close? The images of a group of young men in foreign military uniforms. They are not in a battle. They are working on a farm in the American Midwest. They are prisoners of war, but they are not in a grim barbed wire camp like you might imagine. They are living and working among the very people they were sent to fight. This is one of the least known stories of the American home front. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States housed over 425,000 prisoners of war, mostly from the German army. They were held in hundreds of camps all across the country, many of them in small, rural towns. With so many American men away at war, the country faced a severe labor shortage, especially in agriculture and industries like logging and canning. The solution was to use the prisoners as a workforce. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work. They were paid a small wage, usually about 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which they could use to buy things like soap and cigarettes at the camp store. This led to some surreal situations. Farmers in places like Minnesota or Georgia would go to the local POW camp in the morning, sign out a dozen German soldiers, and take them to work in their fields for the day. At night, they would bring them back to the camp. For many Americans, this was their first and only interaction with the enemy. And they discovered that the enemy looked a lot like them. They were young men, far from home, who were often just as tired of the war as everyone else. In many cases, friendships developed between the prisoners and the local families they worked for. They shared meals, learned a little of each other's languages, and discovered a common humanity. As historian Arnold Kramer documents in his book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, the experience profoundly changed the worldview of many of these prisoners. They were exposed to American democracy and culture firsthand. After the war, thousands of them applied to immigrate to the United States. Of course, it wasn't always a positive experience. There were escape attempts, and some prisoners remained devoted to their ideology. But the overwhelming story is one of peaceful and often friendly coexistence. It was a strange and forgotten chapter of the war, where the lines between enemy and neighbor became blurred in the everyday routine of farm work. But this peaceful picture leaves many questions unanswered. How many acts of resistance or sabotage by the prisoners went unreported? We have the official records of the labor program, but what were the private conversations and thoughts of the American farmers who employed these men? And how did the experience of being a prisoner in the relative comfort and safety of America contrast with the experiences of Allied prisoners in Axis camps, a story that is much better known but still full of unrecorded details? Number 4. How do you teach a child about a world on fire? The picture is of a classroom of elementary school students. They are all huddled under their desks. This isn't a game. This is an air raid drill. For children growing up during the war, the conflict was a constant presence in their lives, shaping their education, their games, and their view of the world. Mock schools became a part of the war machine. Students learned about geography by tracking the progress of the armies on maps pinned to the classroom wall. Math problems might involve calculating the production of tanks or the trajectory of an artillery shell. Art class was for drawing war bond posters. The curriculum was infused with patriotism and the need to support the war effort. But the war was not just an academic subject, it was a physical reality. In Britain, millions of children were evacuated from the cities to the countryside to protect them from the bombing. This was a massive social experiment documented in personal accounts like Carrie's War by Nina Bawden. And children were separated from their families and sent to live with strangers in unfamiliar places. For some, it was a grand adventure. For others, it was a deeply traumatic experience. In the US, the threat of attack was more distant, but children were still prepared for it. They participated in air raid drills and learned how to identify enemy aircraft from silhouette cards. They were a vital part of the home front effort. They collected scrap metal, kitchen fat, and newspapers. They bought war-saving stamps with their pocket money. They knit squares for soldiers' blankets. They were told that these small actions were helping to win the war, and they took this responsibility very seriously. Even their games were shaped by the war. They played soldiers in the backyard, reenacting battles they heard about on the radio. Comic book heroes like Captain America and Superman spent their time fighting the Axis powers. The war was everywhere. This constant exposure to the language and imagery of conflict had a profound effect on this generation. They grew up fast, forced to confront adult realities at a very young age. They learned about sacrifice, duty, and loss. But they also learned about resilience and community. The war created a powerful sense of shared purpose that included even the youngest citizens. But what are the hidden stories of these wartime childhoods? How did the constant anxiety and fear affect their long-term psychological development? We have the official school records, but what about the games they invented, the rumors they whispered, and the secret fears they shared with each other? And how did the simplified good versus evil narrative of the war taught in schools shape their understanding of the world as they grew into adults? Number 3, what happens when the lights go out all over the world? The image is a city street at night, but it's almost completely dark. The only light comes from the moon and the tiny shielded slivers of car headlights. This is a city under blackout. It was one of the most pervasive and eerie experiences of life on the home front. The purpose of the blackout was simple: to prevent enemy bombers from being able to see their targets at night. In Britain, the blackout was total and strictly enforced from the very first day of the war. Streetlights were turned off. People had to cover their windows with thick black material. Even a tiny crack of light could result in a fine from the local air raid warden. This plunged the country into an almost medieval darkness. Getting around at night became difficult and dangerous. People would, bump into each other on the street. Traffic accidents increased dramatically. To help, people painted white stripes on lampposts and curbs. Some even painted the bumpers of their cars white. Women would put reflective buttons on their coats or carry a white handkerchief to be more visible. In the United States, the blackouts were mostly limited to coastal areas and were more often drills than a constant reality. But the fear was real. The image of a dark and vulnerable coastline was a powerful one, but the blackout had other unintended consequences. As explored in social histories like Millions Like Us by Virginia Nicholson, the darkness changed social behavior. With the streets so dark, crime rates went up in some areas, but the darkness also provided a strange kind of privacy and freedom. It became a cloak for young couples seeking a moment alone. The psychological effect was profound. The constant darkness was depressing and anxiety-inducing. But it also created a new sense of community. People had to rely on each other more. Strangers would help each other navigate the dark streets. The shared experience of huddling in the dark during an air raid forged powerful bonds. And then there was the sky. With all the city lights gone, people could see the stars in a way they never had before. In the midst of the fear and darkness, this accidental beauty was a small but powerful source of wonder. It was a reminder that there was a vast, peaceful universe beyond the troubles on Earth, but the history of the blackout is filled with darkness itself. How many accidents, crimes, and personal tragedies occurred under the cover of the blackout and were never officially recorded? We know the rules and the official statistics, but what was the subjective sensory experience of living in a world without light for years on end? And did this long period of forced darkness permanently change people's relationship with the night and their sense of safety? Number 2, could a joke be a form of resistance? Picture a group of people in an occupied city. They are huddled together, talking in low voices. One of them tells a joke, and for a brief moment, they all laugh. It's a dangerous laugh. It's a joke about the occupying forces or their leaders, and it's an act of rebellion. In a totalitarian state or an occupied country, humor becomes a weapon. It's a way to maintain your sanity and your humanity when you are powerless. Jokes, cartoons, and satirical songs become a form of underground resistance. They spread quickly, passed from person to person in whispers. To be caught telling such a joke could mean imprisonment or worse, but people told them anyway. This whisper humor was a way to puncture the inflated self-importance of the authorities. It pointed out the absurdities and hypocrisies of their propaganda. For example, a common joke in German-occupied territories related to the constant food shortages. The punchline was often that the only thing plentiful was pictures of the leader. This kind of humor created a secret, shared understanding among the oppressed. It was a way of saying, we are not fooled, we see the truth, and we are not alone. Even in countries not under occupation, humor was a vital part of the war effort. On the Allied side, cartoons and comedy were used to mock the enemy leaders, portraying them as bumbling, incompetent figures. This was a way to reduce fear and build confidence. Political cartoonists like the American Bill Malden became famous for their work. Malden's Willie and Joe cartoons depicted the war from the perspective of the ordinary, long-suffering infantry soldier. They were gritty, realistic, and often darkly funny. They were beloved by the troops because they captured the truth of their experience. Humor was also a crucial coping mechanism. Soldiers in trenches, sailors on ships, and pilots waiting for a mission used jokes and dark humor to deal with the constant stress and fear of death. It was a way to release tension and bond with their comrades. The ability to laugh in the face of terrible circumstances was a form of psychological armor. The study of wartime humor reveals a hidden transcript of public opinion. The jokes people told show what they were really thinking and feeling, things they could not say out loud. Historians who study these jokes, like Rudolf Herzog in his book Dead Funny, see them as a valuable source for understanding the mood of a population under extreme pressure. But this is a difficult history to capture. By its very nature, this kind of humor was ephemeral and unrecorded. So what do we not know? How many different versions of the same political joke existed, and how did they change as they spread from town to town? Who were the anonymous brilliant wits who created the jokes that gave millions of people a reason to laugh in the dark? And how many acts of quiet defiance, a shared smile, or a knowing glance after a risky joke happened and were instantly forgotten, leaving no trace in the historical record? Number 1. What did peace feel like? The final image is the most famous one. A sailor is kissing a woman in the middle of Times Square. The street is filled with a massive, cheering crowd. The war is over. It is VJ Day, August 14th, 1945. It is a picture of pure, uninhibited joy. After years of fighting, loss, and sacrifice, the end of the war unleashed a wave of emotion that is hard to comprehend today. In cities all over the world, London, Paris, New York, Sydney, people poured into the streets. Strangers hugged and kissed each other. They danced, they sang, they cried. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a release of years of pent-up fear and grief. For the soldiers overseas, the news came over the radio or through a commanding officer's announcement. The reaction was not always the explosive joy seen in the cities. For many, it was a quieter, more profound sense of relief. The constant threat of death was finally gone. They had survived. They were going home. But the celebration was only the beginning of a new and difficult journey. The world was broken. Cities were in ruins. Millions of people were displaced, living in refugee camps. The global economy was shattered. The work of rebuilding would take decades. And for the individuals, the transition back to normal life was not easy. Millions of soldiers had to find their place in a civilian world. they no longer recognized. They had to deal with the psychological scars of what they had seen and done. Your families had to get to know each other again after years of separation. The women who had worked in the factories had to figure out their new roles. The teenagers who had grown up in the shadow of the war had to imagine a future that wasn't defined by conflict. The end of the war was not a simple happy ending. It was the start of a new, uncertain chapter. The joy of victory was mixed with the profound sorrow of loss. Nearly every family had lost someone, a son, a husband, a father, a friend. The world had changed forever. The alliances that had won the war were already beginning to fracture, setting the stage for the new conflicts of the post-war era. We have the photographs and the newsreels of the celebrations. We have the statistics of the economic recovery. But what are the questions that remain from that monumental moment of transition? How did the sudden silence after years of hearing sirens and bombs feel to the people who had lived through it? We know how many soldiers came home, but how many never truly left the battlefield behind in their minds? And as the last people who remember that day leave us, what essential human understanding of that incredible moment of global relief and trepidation are we losing forever?